I'm not going to read the entire article to you this time. You can go back and do that on your own. But we are going to focus this time for the third read on some signposts. And we've talked about these. I'm going to give you a couple of different examples as we go through and then give you the rest of the time to go back and look for your own. So I'm going to skip through these first couple. And I want to talk, the first one is called numbers and stats. This is when an author uses a specific number, a number word, amount, or a percentage. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that every single number that you see is a number and stat. So, for example, at the beginning it says in 2006. The date of when the article was written or when it happened is not necessarily critical to understanding the topic every time. If you think that the date is important, then that might be something that you could annotate. In this case, it's just telling you when it happened. Unless that date is significant, maybe it's contradicting another date that was mentioned, then you might think of it as a number and stat. But here it's just kind of establishing when this happened. So I wouldn't count that as a number and stat. When we see a number, and I think of like percentages, something that's written on a chart or a graph, we might ask ourselves, why did the author use these particular numbers? What do they help me see? We could look for some facts that they tell us about, some comparisons. They might provide evidence, and they might show trends. So if you look on paragraph 7 here, it says, for one, it's tiny, just 17 miles across, and distinctly not a sphere. This is referring to that Ultima Thule, the spacecraft that's going out to explore it for the first time. So when I think about that number, for one, it's tiny, just 17 miles across and distinctly not a sphere. I know that it's not a planet because we were talking about if it was a planet, it would be a sphere. So I'm trying to visualize what this entity, this thing that looks like 17 miles across, floating out in space, out near or past Pluto, yet orbiting our sun, what 17 miles looks like. So I did a little Google search because 17 miles to me doesn't mean a whole lot unless I understand the distance. So 17 miles is the distance from Chardon to Willoughby. And if you don't know where Willoughby is, it's a little bit past Mentor, past the Mentor Mall. Okay, so imagine this body, this celestial body floating in space. That's the distance from Chardon to Willoughby. I also was thinking about a marathon is 26 miles. So this object, the width of this thing that's floating around in space, is less than the distance that would be a marathon. Okay, so when you see a number in stat, number one, you have to put it in the context of something that you find familiar, something that you can relate to, and then think about why that's important. Now, within this article, I did not see another number and stat that was significant, but I thought this one was very interesting to me. Okay, so when I wrote this, my annotation looks like this. Hashtag NS, the number is 17 miles, equal to the distance from Chardon to Willoughby. And what does that mean to me? Well, it's a lot smaller than I would picture. You know, if we're talking about a planet or the possibility of these things floating around in space being planets, that's not very big. The next signpost we're going to talk about, and we're not going to watch this today, maybe when I come back we will, has to do with extreme and absolute language. This is when an author uses language that seems to exaggerate something and leave no doubt. Actually, let's go ahead and watch it. See if it records. World's best cup of coffee. Oh, this isn't going to work for me. If you've seen Elf, though, then you know how excited he gets about this. That would be an example of extreme and absolute language because it's the best. Oh, well. So in our article, when we see something that seems like a very strong word that the author used, I might ask myself, why did the author say it like that? Because it might tell me about his point of view, his purpose, or it might exaggerate a little bit and point me towards some bias. So some words we could look for: always, irreversible, totally, indisputably, unconditionally, everyone, or every, or entirely. These include every single one within that group, and we know that that probably isn't going to be true. So here I had some extreme and absolute language where the author uses some really strong words with strong connotation. We know that he's very upset about this change in the status of Pluto. So some of the words he uses here: drawn hastily, obvious flaws, disqualifies, ignoring. He's very negative and degrading towards the IAU scientists who have changed their mind about Pluto. And he uses some pretty strong wording within his article to show that. Okay. So in the next paragraph, and I'm going to go through it very quickly, but in the next page, or the next couple of paragraphs, 12 and 13, I want you to look for some more examples. I don't want you to look at mine, so I went through those fast. All right, so let's talk about contrast and contradictions then. We use these with our literary signposts. The same thing is true when we read nonfiction. When the author shows ideas that contradict each other, or information that contrasts with what you already know, you should ask yourself, what's the difference? Why does it matter? If you can answer those questions, it'll help you understand the author's purpose, a main idea of the text, might make a comparison, a cause and effect, help you infer something, or make a generalization. Okay, and we'll watch this little video later. So some text clues. Alternatively, however, notice a lot of these are transitions. You might see them at the beginnings of sentences where they're connecting ideas together. So here it says, I have a contrast and contradiction, was when they said that Earth was not a planet. Okay, that contradicts everything that I've ever known. And so it gave two qualifiers, two reasons why they're saying it might not have been a planet if it was moved to an asteroid belt, or 500 million years ago, if we go based on the IAU definition of what a planet is. And so the author is using this evidence, or this idea, saying, well, then Earth isn't a planet, because there's obviously no way to dispute the fact that we think Earth is a planet. It's where we live. It's always been a planet. But if we go by the IAU definition, then what they're telling us is it might not have been. And that's something that most people in the world are going to have a pretty hard time standing behind. All right, so there are some other places where there are contrasts and contradictions. So I would like for you to maybe go through and look to see if you can find some of those. When you are done,